The signal did not come with a warning. It did not arrive with noise or fire or the shake of distant guns. It came quietly, slipping through the dark like a whisper passed under a door, and it was so old that the machine which caught it took 3 full seconds to decide whether it was real. At Outpost Varan, a relay station sitting at the farthest edge of Accord-claimed space, most nights were the same. Nothing moved out there except light, and light was slow and old and rarely said anything worth hearing. The crew of 9 ran their checks, logged their readings, and traded the same tired jokes over cold food. The station was not an assignment people wanted. It was an assignment people were given when someone with authority had decided they needed to be somewhere quiet. Orville had been on the station for 11 months. He was Dravosi, which meant 4 arms, a long gray face, and a mind built for patterns. Before the posting, he had been a historian at the University of Drevenis, writing papers that very few people read. He had said something at a council gathering that annoyed someone important, and here he was, watching the dark between stars and listening to nothing. Until the nothing changed. He was alone in the signal room when the machine flagged the anomaly. It did not ring or flash. It simply added a small marker to the readout, the way a careful person places a finger on a page to hold their place. Orville almost missed it. He had been reading from a handheld text with his lower 2 arms while his upper hands ran the standard sweep. He put the text down. The signal was repeating. Not random, not the scatter of dead stars throwing off old light, but structured, rhythmic, deliberate. Something had made it on purpose. Something had wanted it to be heard. Orville pulled the encoding pattern and ran it through the station archive. The archive was broad, containing records going back to before the Accord itself existed, back to the days of the Tethan Compact, and before that, back to the earliest years of interstellar contact. The match took a little over a minute to surface, because the archive had to search a very old section, one that was not often opened. The encoding matched a class of military identification signals used by a species the Accord no longer formally acknowledged. Not because that species had done something wrong, not because their history had been removed, but because, officially, they no longer existed. The signal was human. Orville sat with that knowledge for a moment. He turned it over the way he turned over old artifacts when he found them, carefully, checking each surface before deciding what to do next. Then he sent a message to the station commander, a Dravosi patrol officer named Dunn, who arrived in the signal room 4 minutes later with a tired look on his face that did not survive his first glance at the readout. Dunn ordered a passive scan. No active pings, nothing that would announce the station's attention. Just listening, the way you listen at a wall when you are not sure what is on the other side. The scan took 20 minutes to compile. When it returned its result, neither of them spoke for a long time. There was not one ship. There were thousands. They sat in the darkness beyond the edge of Accord-mapped space, in a region that charts described simply as the Veil Nebula Approach, a place where the gas and light of an ancient dead star had spread into a curtain that made long-range scans unreliable. The fleet was holding position just inside that curtain, and it was enormous. Thousands of vessels, arranged not randomly, not drifting, but held in geometric order so precise that it made Orville think of old military diagrams in history texts, drawings made to explain how ancient armies stood before a battle. The ships were not broadcasting heat. They were not putting out drive signatures. They were running completely dark except for that one repeating signal, that single quiet code that said, "We are here, we are friendly, we are waiting to be recognized." Orville pulled up the old human military records from the deepest part of the archive. The files had access restrictions on them, not illegal to read, but marked in the way things are marked when someone official long ago had decided they should not be read casually. He went through the restrictions using his historian credentials and opened the records. He found the IFF classification for the signal, Third Fleet, Allied Nations of Earth. Last confirmed active status, the year 2241 by the Old Accord calendar. The year of the Great Severance War, the conflict in which humanity had fought and, according to every official account ever written, lost. The war in which they had vanished, gone dark, presumed dead. 2,000 years ago. Orville looked at the scan result again. He looked at the number of ships. He looked at the formation they were holding, tight and exact and patient. The way a force holds formation when it has been trained to hold it no matter how long the wait becomes. He thought about what it meant that they were holding a battle formation, not a travel arrangement, not the loose spread of ships moving from one place to another. A formation built for coordination, for response, for the kind of organized movement that only matters when you are ready to act. He thought about the fact that, in 2,000 years, the Accord had never once gone looking for them. He thought about the fact that the signal was not a distress call. It was not asking for help. It was an identification code, the kind used to say to a scanner, "I see you looking. Here is who I am." He wrote one line in his log before he called the message through to the Patrol Cruiser Command. He wrote it because he was a historian, and historians recorded the moment they understood something, not just the moment it happened. He wrote, "They are not drifting, they are in formation, battle formation." Then he opened the channel and started talking, and the long quiet of Outpost Varen ended for good. Inside the sealed chamber of the Accord High Council on Drevenus Prime, 7 of the 17 member species were present in person, and the rest attended through projection. The room had high ceilings and old stone walls, built in an era when the Accord had believed that permanence in architecture meant permanence in law. The chamber had seen 600 years of decisions. Tonight it looked like it might not survive the 7th century. Senator Udhose of the Callery stood at the center speaking position and kept his voice level, which required effort, because what he actually wanted to do was shout. He was a thin man with pale gold skin and eyes that moved quickly, always checking who in the room was watching him, always measuring. He had built 20 years of political power on the idea that the outer rim needed to be controlled tightly, that loose borders meant loose civilization, and that anything unfamiliar arriving from the dark should be treated as a problem before it was treated as a question. Thousands of unidentified vessels at the edge of Accord space qualified, in his view, as a very large problem. He argued for an immediate military response. Not an attack, he said carefully, using the word carefully the way people use sharp tools, but a show of force. A clear establishment of Accord authority at the boundary. The fleet, whatever it was, should be made to understand that it had arrived in governed space, and governed space had rules. 3 delegations agreed with him. 2 were uncertain. The Dravosi delegation, seated in a curved row to the left of the central floor, was quiet. Orville had arrived at the chamber 3 hours after transmitting his report. He had come not because anyone had summoned him, but because the archive files he had pulled at the station had attached themselves to his clearance log and triggered a review flag, and someone in the Council Intelligence Office had decided they wanted the person who opened those files present when the discussion happened. He sat behind the delegation's senior members in an observer seat, which meant he could listen but not speak unless called upon. He was called upon sooner than expected. The Council's chief intelligence reader, a Callery woman named Reth, presented the signal data and the fleet scan numbers without elaboration. When she finished, one of the undecided delegates asked whether there was any historical parallel for an event of this kind. The question was directed at the room in general. The senior Dravosi delegate turned and looked at Orville. Orville walked to the floor. He told them what the signal encoding meant. He told them which fleet it matched. He watched the room process the name, some faces going still, some going careful, 1 or 2 going a color that on their species indicated genuine alarm. Then he told them what he had found when he went deeper into the archive files, past the access restriction markers, into the records that carried the notation, historical sensitivity, not for public distribution. He told them the real story of the Severance War. The official account, the one taught in schools and printed in Accord historical summaries, said that humanity had overreached. They had been an aggressive young species, expanding too fast, picking conflicts with neighbors they could not afford to fight. The Tethan Compact, the predecessor organization to the Accord, had responded to human aggression, and the war had ended when humanity collapsed under the pressure of its own ambition and fled into unknown space, where they had presumably died out over the following centuries. The archive files said something different. By the third year of the Severance War, the human fleet had not been losing. It had been winning. Not overwhelmingly, not without cost, but consistently and with increasing efficiency. The Compact's own internal assessments, filed privately and never released, described the human forces as adapting faster than any opposition the Compact had previously encountered. The assessments used a word that Orville translated carefully from the old Compact dialect: relentless. The Compact had a weapon they called the Veil Pulse. It was a gravitational compression device capable of collapsing the stable stellar lanes, the natural pathways through space that made fast travel between star systems possible. The lanes, once collapsed, could not be reopened by any technology the Compact possessed. The weapon had been banned by the Compact's own founding charter, classified as a civilization-ending act if used against an inhabited region. In the 44th month of the Severance War, the Compact used it on the stellar lanes leading into human space. They did not destroy humanity. They sealed them in. Every route in and every route out of the region humanity occupied was collapsed simultaneously. The human fleet, which had been operating across a wide front, was caught on the outer side of its own territory, cut off from its home systems, surrounded by collapsed lanes that could not be passed. The Compact filed a classified report the following month stating that the human problem had been resolved. No further details, no confirmation of casualties, no accounting of what had happened to the fleet or the population. Resolved was the whole of it. The chamber was very quiet when Orville finished. Senator Udhose recovered first. He said the files were old, that their authenticity could not be confirmed, that acting on unverified historical documents in a crisis situation was exactly the kind of reckless behavior the Council existed to prevent. He said it with authority and speed, the way a person talks when they want to fill the air before someone else can. Orville said the files carried Compact authentication codes that were not forgeable with any technology available at the time of their creation, and that the Council's own archive office could confirm this in under an hour. The room went quiet again. On the other side of that silence, 30 light-years away in the dark near the Veil Nebula, the flagship of the returning human fleet sat at the head of its formation and waited. It was called the ANS Enduring Will, and it was the largest vessel the Accord scans had ever recorded. The letters ANS stood for Allied Nations Ship, a designation from a government that the Accord had declared extinct 2,000 years ago. On its command deck, Fleet Admiral Soren Ivik stood at the forward viewport and looked at the distant light of Accord space. She was 63 years old, which in the fleet's current medical terms meant she was somewhere in the early middle of her life. She had short gray hair and the kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from long practice at holding things inside where they do not interfere with the work. She had been told about the patrol station picking up their IFF code. She had allowed it. The code had been broadcasting by design, precisely timed, precisely aimed, because Ivik did not do things accidentally. Her communications officer, a young man named Gale, looked up from his board and said that an Accord patrol cruiser was moving toward the edge of scan range. Not approaching, just watching. Ivik nodded once. She said to open a channel on the same frequency as the IFF signal, standard Accord broadcasting coding, and to keep it simple. Gale opened the channel. Ivik spoke without notes, without ceremony, in clear and level accord standard, which she spoke without any trace of an accent because the fleet's language programs had spent a century refining it. She said, "This is Fleet Admiral Soren Ivik of the Allied Nations ship Enduring Will. We are returning from the long vigil. Please advise if Earth still stands. We have been away." She closed the channel. She stood at the viewport for a while longer, watching the distant light, and her face was the face of someone who already knew the answer to the question they had just asked, but understood that some things had to be said aloud before the next thing could begin. The shuttle was very small. That was the first thing Mediator Senva noticed when she arrived at the docking ring of Accord platform Hollow Crown. The platform was a diplomatic station, wide and pale, and built to project the impression that the Accord was large and stable, and not the sort of organization that became nervous. It had hosted delegations from every member species and several non-member ones. It had wide corridors and meeting halls, designed to accommodate beings of many different sizes and atmospheric preferences. The human shuttle that docked at Ring 7 was smaller than the Accord standard courier craft. It had no escort. It had no protective formation hanging at a distance. It had arrived alone from the direction of the human fleet, crossing the intervening space at a modest speed with no weapons charged and no shields raised, broadcasting nothing except its approach vector and a simple audio message that said only, "Commander Dara Voss, diplomatic representative, Allied Nations of the Long Vigil," requesting permission to come alongside. The permission had been granted, because refusing it would have required a reason, and the Council had not yet agreed on what that reason should be. Senva was Callery, from the same species as Senator Udhose, which she considered an ongoing inconvenience of birth. She was a mediator by training and by genuine preference. She believed that most conflicts were failures of translation, that most breakdowns happened because someone had said a word that meant one thing to them and another thing entirely to the person hearing it, and that a patient and precise examination of the words usually found the place where things had gone wrong. She had resolved 14 interspecies disputes in her career. She was good at her work. She did not feel especially confident as she stood at the docking ring and watched the airlock cycle. The woman who came through was not what Senva had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. Dara Voss was younger than the admiral they had heard on the broadcast. She was perhaps 35, with dark skin, close-cropped hair, and an expression that was not unfriendly but was also not soft. She was dressed in a fitted gray uniform with no insignia except a small emblem on the left shoulder, a circle with 3 lines crossing it, which Senva later learned was the Long Vigil's navigational mark, used on every ship log and document produced during the 2,000 years of travel. She was alone. Not alone as in her escort was waiting in the shuttle. Alone as in no escort existed. One human, one shuttle, one bag of documents, walking into the diplomatic center of the civilization that had imprisoned her people. Senva introduced herself. Dara Voss shook her hand, which was apparently a human greeting gesture that the fleet had maintained. She had a firm grip and held it for exactly the right amount of time, not long enough to be strange, not short enough to be dismissive. She said it was good to meet her, and she sounded like she meant it, which Senva found both reassuring and somehow difficult to process given the circumstances. They walked to the main meeting hall, where 4 Accord delegates were waiting, including Orville, who was attending as a cultural observer. There were also 2 Accord security personnel standing at the far end of the hall, and Senva noticed that Dara noticed them and said nothing. Before any formal agenda was presented, before any statement of purpose or protocol was established, Dara Voss set her bag on the table and asked a question. She said, "Where is Earth?" She asked it plainly. Without weight, the way you ask about something you need to know in order to plan the rest of your day, But the room understood that it was not a small question. Senva looked at the delegate beside her, and then she answered. She said that the Sol system had been unoccupied for roughly 1,800 years, that the planetary conditions had changed significantly due to a lack of maintenance and intervention, that Earth itself was still present but no longer habitable in its previous form. Dara listened to all of this without moving. When Senva finished, Dara said, "I see. Then we will need to discuss reparations at some point, but not today." She said it the way you put a very heavy item down on a table rather than on the floor, carefully, deliberately, with the clear intention of coming back to it later. The word reparations sat in the room for a moment before anyone moved past it. The Accord delegates had prepared a framework for the conversation. It described the returning fleet as a displaced population in need of humanitarian recognition, and outlined a process by which the humans could apply for resettlement status under Accord law and request provisional territorial rights. It was not an unkind framework. It was also a framework that treated humanity as a group of refugees rather than a government, and the difference between those two things was enormous. Dara let the delegate finish presenting it. She did not interrupt. When he was done, she opened her bag and placed a stack of physical documents on the table. Beside them, she set a data card. The physical documents were ship logs, not copies, originals, or what the fleet called originals. Continuous handwritten and printed records maintained aboard every ship from the first day of the long vigil to the present. The data card contained the digital archive of the same, fully indexed, cross-referenced, and authenticated with cryptographic signatures that could be traced to the original encoding systems. She walked the delegates through the documents with the patience of someone who had prepared this presentation many times in her head and was now simply executing it. Every generation of fleet leadership had formally renewed the governmental charter of the Allied Nations of Earth. The renewal ceremonies had been recorded, witnessed, and logged. Not once in 2,000 years had the charter lapsed. Not once had the governing body dissolved. The fleet had maintained continuous democratic representation across all vessels throughout the entire journey, with elections held on schedule, councils convened on schedule, and laws passed and recorded on schedule. She said, "The Allied Nations of the Long Vigil is not a new government. It is not a successor government. It is the same government that went to war 2,000 years ago, still in operation, never dissolved, never surrendered. Under the Accord's own founding charter, a recognized sovereign government that has not surrendered its status retains that status regardless of territorial displacement." The delegate beside Senva made a note on his pad. Senva noticed his hand was moving carefully. Then Dara said that she also wanted to address the legal status of the Veil Pulse. At the far end of the table, one of the delegates shifted in his seat. Dara did not raise her voice. She explained, using the Accord's own legal terminology, that the Veil Pulse had been prohibited under the Tethan Compact's founding charter, which the Accord had formally inherited in its entirety when it replaced the Compact as the governing body of known space. Inherited in its entirety meant inherited including the prohibitions. It also meant inherited including the obligations attached to violations of those prohibitions. She placed two more documents on the table. Both were from the sealed archive, the same one Orville had opened. She had received copies from Orville the previous evening, passed to her through the shuttle's communication link before her arrival. She had read them in 6 hours and had spent another 2 hours organizing her response. Senva looked at Orville. He was watching Dara with an expression that was not quite surprise. It was the expression of someone watching a thing they had suspected was possible, but had not been certain they would live to see. The delegate who had proposed the humanitarian framework asked how the fleet had obtained those files. Dara said that the method of obtaining publicly relevant evidence of a crime was a secondary matter, and that the primary matter was the evidence itself. She said it pleasantly, without any sharpness, and somehow that made it land harder than sharpness would have. The meeting ran for 9 hours. By the end of it, the humanitarian resettlement framework had been withdrawn from consideration, and the Accord's legal team had requested a 3-day adjournment. Dara Voss agreed to the adjournment, packed her bag, and walked back to the docking ring. Before she boarded her shuttle, she paused and turned to Orville, who had followed at a distance, not quite sure why. She said, "Thank you for opening the files." He said he had simply done what a historian does. She said, "So did we." Then she went aboard the shuttle and was gone, back across the dark to the fleet, and Orville stood at the docking ring for a long time before he went to write in his journal. There is a kind of understanding that comes not from being told something, but from seeing it. Orville had read about the long vigil. He had read the fleet's own transmitted records, the summaries Dara Voss had shared, the population figures and the timeline and the list of ships. He had processed all of it as information, numbers and words and data that his trained historian's mind had filed and categorized and cross-referenced. None of it had prepared him for the moment the shuttle carrying him broke through the outer picket line of the human fleet, and he saw it with his own eyes. He had been granted a diplomatic tour, the first alien ever given access to a human vessel. The invitation had come from Dara Voss, extended on behalf of Admiral Ivak, and it had been framed simply as an offer of transparency. Come and see. The Accord had been talking about the fleet as though it were a mystery to be solved. The fleet, apparently, had decided to solve that for them. The picket line alone was something. 12 vessels, each one roughly twice the size of an Accord patrol cruiser, holding position in a precise arc at the edge of the fleet's outer range. They were not painted or decorated. They were dark metal, angular, and the surface caught light strangely, absorbing more than it reflected. Orville asked the human pilot beside him about the hull material. The pilot, a young woman named Uri with a cheerful manner that had not faded despite 6 hours of travel, said it was an energy-absorptive composite the fleet's materials division had developed about 400 years into the vigil. She said the older ships still had standard alloy hulls, but anything built in the last 5 centuries used the new composite. She said it the way someone says that they switched from one type of shoe to another, like it was a practical improvement, nothing more. Then the fleet itself came into view. Orville had a word in his native language for the feeling he experienced at that moment. Dravosi had many words for specific types of awe, the way some languages had many words for specific types of rain. The word he thought of was one that translated roughly as the awe of discovering that something is far larger than the space you had made for it in your mind. The fleet was not a collection of ships. It was a civilization moving through space. The largest vessels were city ships, and calling them ships felt inadequate in the same way that calling a mountain, a pile of rocks, felt inadequate. They were structures that generated their own gravitational fields, that carried within them parks and schools and hospitals and manufacturing facilities and research centers. The smallest ships in the fleet, the couriers and scouts and single-crew craft, moved between the larger vessels like small fish moving around the bodies of much larger ones, and there were hundreds of them visible at any given moment. Uri told him the total count as she guided the shuttle toward the flagship. 6,241 vessels at present count, with 7 more in final construction stages aboard one of the city ships. She said it the way she said everything, matter-of-factly, because to her this was simply home. She had been born on a mid-size vessel called the Persistent. Her mother had been born there too, and her mother's mother. 4 generations had lived and worked on the same ship, and the ship was so large that none of them had ever felt trapped. Orville asked how many people were aboard the fleet in total. Uri said a little over 900 million, current census, which updated every 3 months. The original fleet had carried roughly 4 million. He thought about that number. He thought about what 4 million people, cut off from every resource except what they could find or make, had done with 2,000 years and enough stubbornness to refuse the ending that had been written for them. 900 million people, not survivors, not a remnant, a civilization. The ANS Enduring Will was the largest vessel in the fleet by a significant margin, and when the shuttle pulled into its docking bay, the bay alone was larger than the main structure of a cord platform hollow crown. Orville stepped out onto the deck and stood still for a moment because the scale of the interior required a moment. Commander Dara Voss met him at the bay entrance and walked with him through the ship. She had offered the tour herself, and she conducted it herself, without staff, which told Orville something about how the fleet approached things. They did not delegate the tasks that mattered. She showed him the engineering levels first because, she said, that was where the story of the vigil was most honestly told. The ship's drive system occupied a section of the vessel that would have qualified as a large building on any Accord world. It had been redesigned and rebuilt 12 times in 2,000 years, each version more efficient than the last. The current version had been running continuously for 70 years and showed no signs of requiring significant maintenance. The engineer on duty, a broad-shouldered man named Bren, who was perhaps 25 years old, walked Orville through the system with the quiet pride of someone who had grown up knowing this machinery the way other people know the streets of a city they were born in. Orville asked Bren what his specialty was. Bren said drive efficiency and hull material integration. He had spent 6 years working on improving the energy absorption coefficient of the composite hull and was currently 3 months from completing a project that would improve it by another 9%. He said 9% the way a craftsman talks about finishing a piece of work well. Like the number mattered not because of what it meant strategically, but because doing the thing properly mattered. Orville asked him something he had been wanting to ask since he arrived on the fleet. He said, what was the long vigil like? Not for the people who started it, for the people who grew up inside it. Bren was quiet for a moment, looking at the drive housing with the kind of look people give to things they are genuinely fond of. Then he said that his great-grandmother had told his grandmother, who had told his mother, who had told him, "We do not grieve the stars we cannot reach yet. We learn to reach farther." He paused and added, "She also told them that humans are stubborn enough to make the universe blink first." He said it without any particular drama, like it was simply a fact, tested and confirmed. The medical bay was its own revelation. The fleet's medical technology had evolved over 2,000 years of necessity and research, and what it had arrived at bore little resemblance to Accord's standard care. Disease management was nearly total. Injury recovery was rapid. The natural human lifespan had been extended to somewhere between 160 and 180 years without genetic modification, simply through understanding how the human body aged and addressing each element one at a time over many generations of research. The medical director, a quiet woman named Phi, explained this with the unhurried manner of someone describing solved problems. The problems had been difficult when they were first encountered. They were solved now. Orville asked about weapons. Dara took him to the weapons level without hesitation and without limiting what he could see. The systems there were not what he had expected from a fleet that had been preparing for war for 2,000 years. He had expected mass, overwhelming force, the kind of weaponry you build when your goal is to destroy everything in front of you as quickly as possible. What he found was precision. The targeting systems were extraordinary, capable of identifying and isolating a single vessel in a field of thousands, with a margin of error that the Accord's best military technology could not match. The weapons themselves were designed not for maximum destruction, but for minimum excess damage. They had been rebuilt and refined over centuries not to become more powerful, but to become more exact. Dara explained that the fleet had spent a long time deciding what kind of civilization it wanted to be when it returned, and that this decision had shaped every tool they made. She said, "We did not come back to punish anyone. We came back to go home." On the way back to the docking bay, Orville passed a classroom. Through the window, he saw 20 children seated at low tables, drawing. Their teacher was reading aloud from something. The children were various ages, some small enough that their feet did not reach the floor when they sat. They looked completely unremarkable. They looked like children anywhere, bored and interested by turns, one of them poking another quietly while the teacher's attention was elsewhere. Orville stopped walking and looked at them for a long time. Dara waited beside him, patient, saying nothing. He finally said, "I came here expecting to find survivors." She said, "We know." He said, "I found something else." She nodded and said, "We know that too." That night, alone in the guest cabin assigned to him, Orville opened his journal and wrote for a long time. He wrote about the drive systems and the hull material and the medical bay, and the weapons designed for precision rather than power. He wrote about Bren and his 9% and his great-grandmother's words. He wrote about the children in the classroom. At the end of the entry, he wrote, "The Accord has spent 2,000 years governing known space. In that same span of time, cut off from everything and given nothing, humanity built a civilization that knows itself more completely than we know ourselves. I am no longer certain we understand what we are dealing with. I am not certain we deserve to." It started with a rumor, as many dangerous things do. The rumor moved through the lower chambers of the Accord Council first, the way rumors always move, quietly, passed between aides and junior analysts, and the people who carry messages between the people who make decisions. The rumor said that the human fleet's tactical systems had been running active scans on Accord core worlds, that their ships had been broadcasting encrypted signals to unknown contact points inside Accord space, that the diplomatic talks were a delay tactic, a way to hold Accord attention at the front while something else was being prepared from behind. None of it was true, all of it spread. By the time Senator Udhoe stood before the council chamber to call for an emergency vote, the rumor had acquired details, specific coordinates, specific dates, the kind of particulars that make a story feel real, the way putting a frame on a painting makes it look like something that belongs on a wall. Udhoe's had not started the rumor, but he had done nothing to stop it, and he had let it run for exactly long enough before arriving with a proposal. The proposal was to classify the human fleet as an unauthorized military presence in Accord's sovereign space and authorize a preemptive defensive strike to neutralize the threat before it could act. He used the word defensive with great care. He said it 4 times in the first minute of speaking. He placed it in front of strike like a shield. 3 member species delegations raised their markers in support immediately. A 4th was wavering. A 5th was silent in the way that sometimes meant consideration and sometimes meant waiting to see which direction the current was running before committing. On the enduring will, Fleet Admiral Soren Ivik received the intelligence report about the vote through the fleet's information network, which had been monitoring Accord Council communications since the first day of the talks, not through espionage, but through the simple fact that the Accord broadcast on frequencies the fleet could read. And the fleet had known about the frequencies because they had decoded them from captured signal patterns long before any of the current diplomatic contact had begun. Ivik called a full fleet council. The council met across 600 screens simultaneously, representatives from every significant vessel in the fleet, and the meeting was what a meeting of 900 million people's elected voices looked like when they had been trained their entire lives to make decisions quickly and speak clearly. There was no shouting. There was significant disagreement. The argument for responding with force was made by Admiral Dess of the Heavy Vessel Division, a man who had spent 40 years commanding the fleet's most powerful ships and who was not given to abstractions. He said the fleet's tactical models had already run the numbers. A conflict in open space, fleet against current Accord military capability, produced an 89% favorable outcome for the fleet. He said this without pride, just as information. He said that waiting was a choice with its own costs, that if the Accord struck first, the fleet would take damage it could avoid by acting now, and that 2,000 years of patience had been patience in service of a goal, and they were standing at the goal. 7 other council members spoke in agreement with variations of the same argument. Ivik listened to every one of them. She sat at the head of the council feed and did not interrupt and did not show what she was thinking until everyone who had something to say had said it. Then she spoke. She said the 89% number was accurate. She said she trusted Admiral Dess's assessment entirely. She said she understood the argument and she respected every voice that had made it because it was not a wrong argument. It was simply not the right answer. She said, "We did not keep the long vigil for 2,000 years to become the thing that was done to us." She let that sit for a moment. Then she said that the fleet had spent 20 centuries deciding what kind of civilization it would be, that the weapons on their ships were built for precision, because they had decided destruction without purpose was not strength, that the medical research had gone toward extending life rather than ending it because they had decided that life was the point, that every generation of fleet leadership had renewed the government's charter not just as a legal formality but as a promise. This is who we are, and we will still be this when we get there. She said that firing first at a civilization that had not yet actually done anything would break that promise, not to the Accord, to themselves. She said, "We do not need an 89% chance of winning a war. We need a 100% chance of being worth the victory." The vote was not close. What Ivik authorized instead was a different kind of operation, and it ran the same night. The fleet's intelligence division had maintained a complete copy of the sealed Accord archive files, since Orville had transmitted them during his visit. They had also, over the 3 weeks since the talks began, assembled additional documentation from Accord historical databases that were publicly accessible but not widely read, records from minor species archives, trade logs from the Compact era, cross-referenced testimony from 6 non-Accord civilizations that had witnessed the Severance War from the outside and kept their own records. The Intelligence Division had compiled all of it into a single archive package, clean, organized, indexed, authenticated with every confirmation code available. That package was broadcast simultaneously on every standard Accord communication frequency, translated into every member species language, addressed to the general public of every Accord world, every independent station, every non-aligned outpost within range. The broadcast took 4 minutes. What happened after it was not? The reaction inside the Accord was not immediate, but it was large. The smaller member species, several of whom had themselves been pressured into the Tethan Compact under threat 2,000 years ago, found in the document something they had suspected for a long time. The truth of the Compact's methods had been buried alongside the truth of the Severance War, and the same archive that indicted what had been done to humanity also indicted what had been done to others. Several delegations that had been neutral broke from Udhoz's position. One did it publicly, in a statement broadcast on the same frequencies as the fleet's package, within 6 hours of receiving the documents. The strike vote collapsed. Udhoz understood that the council floor was no longer safe ground. He fell back to a secondary plan, the one he had prepared for the event of a political failure, and he contacted the commander of a classified rapid strike squadron that operated under Executive Council authorization. The squadron had 12 ships, fast and armed, an authorization that technically did not require full council approval. He told the commander that the situation was urgent and that the fleet's flagship was to be targeted, while the diplomatic talks held the fleet's attention forward. The squadron launched. It traveled for 9 minutes toward the human fleet's position. At 9 minutes and 14 seconds, every ship in the squadron found itself surrounded. Not attacked, surrounded. Human vessels had materialized from what the squadron's sensors registered as empty space, a picket line that had been running in near-complete electromagnetic silence on an intercept vector that the squadron's scanners had not detected until the distance between them was too small for any meaningful response. 12 human ships to each of the 12 squadron vessels. No weapons charged. No aggressive positioning. Simply present, in a way that made the word escape feel theoretical. A human communications officer opened a channel to the squadron commander and said, in pleasant and clear accord standard, "We would be glad to escort you back to your berth. Please let us know when you are ready to begin." The squadron returned to port. Senator Udhose was arrested by Accord Internal Security the following morning, on request from a joint filing submitted by 9 member species delegations. The charges related to unauthorized military orders and conspiracy to obstruct a lawful diplomatic process. The arresting officer read him the charges in the corridor outside his own office, and Udhose said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Mediator Senva sent a message to Dara Voss the same afternoon. It said only, "We would like to continue the talks." Dara's reply came within the hour. It said, "We are ready when you are, we have time." On the Enduring Will, Admiral Ivik received the final report from the Intelligence Division, confirming that the squadron had been escorted back without incident, and that no weapons had been discharged by any vessel on either side. She read the report twice, which was her habit, then signed it and filed it. Her aide, a composed young woman named Sela, asked if she wanted anything before the next briefing. Ivik said a cup of something warm would be fine. She sat at her desk and looked at the wall, which was plain gray metal, the same as the rest of the ship, and she thought about the vote she had won, and the vote she had not needed to win, and the squadron that had come at them in the dark and been turned around without a scratch on it. She thought about what her own grandmother had told her, which was the same thing every grandmother in the fleet had told every grandchild for as long as anyone could remember. Patience is not weakness. Patience is the decision to win on the terms you choose, not the terms you are handed. She thought, yes, exactly. Then Sela came back with the warm cup, and Ivik drank it, and the work continued. 6 months later, the treaty table was a long piece of pale stone in a room that had been built specifically for this meeting, on a station that had been constructed at the midpoint between Accord space and the fleet's current position. The station had taken 3 months to build. Both sides had contributed materials and labor. It was the first thing humanity and the Accord had made together, and it looked like both of them, practical and deliberate, and in certain lights, quietly beautiful. The room held 40 delegates, 20 from the Accord Coalition and 20 from the Fleet Council. At the head of the table sat Mediator Senva and Commander Dara Voss, because it had been agreed that the people who had talked the hardest and the longest should be the ones to sit at the front when the talking produced something. Fleet Admiral Ivik was not in the room. She had declined to attend the signing in person, sending a message that said she was a soldier, and that signing documents was properly the work of the government's civilian representatives. The real reason, which Dara understood without being told, was that Ivik did not trust herself to sit in a room with the people who had kept her fleet in the dark for 2,000 years, and not let something show on her face that should not show. She was too honest for ceremonies that required a complicated kind of performance. It was one of the things that had made her a good admiral and would have made her a difficult politician. The document they signed was 47 pages. It had taken 6 months of constant negotiation to produce, and it was still not finished in the sense that treaties are rarely finished, because every sentence in a treaty is an argument that has been temporarily paused rather than permanently resolved. But it was finished enough to sign, and signing it meant something real. The fleet was recognized under Accord law as the allied nations of the Long Vigil, a sovereign government in continuous operation, the legitimate successor and continuation of the pre-Severance Earth government. This was not a new status. It was a formal acknowledgement of a status that had never legally lapsed. The distinction mattered, and the fleet's legal team had insisted on it being stated precisely that way, not granted sovereignty, but recognized as having retained it. 3 star systems were designated as Provisional Allied Nations territory, pending resettlement and infrastructure development. One of them contained what remained of the Sol system. Reparations negotiation was recorded as an ongoing process with its own separate framework, because the number involved was large enough that trying to put it in the main treaty would have doubled the length of the negotiation. Both sides understood this was a conversation that would outlast everyone currently in the room. The fleet's delegates had accepted this timeline without complaint. 2,000 years had given them a very particular relationship with long timelines. Dara signed on behalf of the Allied nations. Senva signed on behalf of the Accord. The other delegates signed below them, a column of names in 12 different scripts that looked, when the page was turned, like a complete thought expressed in many voices at once. After it was done, after the formal statements had been made and the communication feeds cut, and the room began the slow process of becoming a room full of people rather than a room full of history, Orville found Dara standing near the far wall looking at nothing in particular. He had been in every major meeting for 6 months, first as a cultural observer, and then as something closer to an unofficial witness, a person present not because he had authority, but because both sides had come to find his presence useful in the way that an honest observer is always useful when things are complicated. He said that he supposed she would be returning to the fleet now. She said the fleet was already repositioning toward the Sol system. Resettlement crews had been preparing for weeks. She would follow shortly. He asked if she was ready. She thought about the question for a moment in the way she thought about most things completely, without rushing toward an answer just because a space existed for one. Then she said, "I was born on the enduring will. I have never seen a planet. I have studied Earth my entire life, its geography and its history and what it looked like before the vigil, but I have never stood on ground that did not have metal under it." She paused. She said, "I think I will need a moment when I get there, and then I think I will get to work." Orville nodded. He said he hoped she would send word about what it was like. He said he would like to read about it. She said she would make sure he did. 3 weeks after the signing, the first resettlement convoy reached the Sol system. It was a column of 40 vessels, a mix of fleet mid-sized ships and a single city ship designated as the initial base of operations for planetary assessment and reconstruction planning. They came out of transit at the system's edge and spread into a survey formation, and the first thing every crew member did was go to the nearest viewport or external screen and look. The system was quiet. The planets moved in their orbits the way they always had, unaware of what had happened around them or to the species that had once lived on the third one. Jupiter was still enormous. Saturn still wore its rings. The asteroid belt between the inner and outer planets had changed somewhat, redistributed by 2 millennia of unmanaged gravitational interaction. And there was Earth. It was not the Earth of the old recordings. The atmosphere was thick in different ways, and the color from space was not quite the same deep blue that the historical images showed. 2,000 years, without human presence, had allowed some things to heal and changed other things permanently, and the planet that hung in the viewport was recognizable but altered, the way a place is recognizable when you have been away for a very long time and found that it continued without you. On the lead resettlement ship, Bren stood at the viewport in the forward observation room with a group of crew members from the engineering division. Nobody was talking. They were all just looking, the same way Orville had looked at the fleet 6 months ago, with the kind of attention you give to something you cannot entirely fit inside your understanding yet. Bren thought about his great-grandmother, who had never seen this and had spent her life working on the ship systems that would one day make it possible for someone to see it. He thought about the generation before her, and the generation before that, and the chain of people all the way back to the ones who had been cut off from this view, and had made the decision, quietly and without ceremony, that they would not let the chain break. He thought about the word home, which he had grown up using to mean the ship he was born on. He had not known, until this moment, that a word could split in two and mean two things at once without losing either of them. The surface team descended 4 days later, after the initial atmospheric and surface scans were complete. Bren was part of the team. Dara Voss was on the same shuttle. They did not speak much on the way down, because there was not much to say that the moment had not already said better. The shuttle landed in a flat region that the old maps called a plain, in a place where there had once been a city. The city was gone, not destroyed but dissolved, taken apart slowly by weather and time and the indifferent patience of the physical world. The foundations of some structures were still visible under the growth that had covered them, geometric shapes in the earth that were not natural, that spoke of something made rather than grown. But the made thing had been given back to the world, and the world had done what worlds do with the things given back to them. Bren stepped out of the shuttle and put his feet on the ground. It was not like the deck of a ship. It was uneven in ways that the body had no framework for, because no generation of the fleet had walked on anything that was not made. It gave slightly underfoot. It smelled like nothing he had a name for. The sky above him was not the ceiling of a corridor or the dome of a ship's observation room. It went up and kept going and did not stop. He stood there for a while. Other crew members came out around him, and they all stood in the same way, slightly still, processing something through senses that had never had occasion to process it before. Dara walked a short distance from the shuttle and stood looking at the horizon. The sun was at a low angle, and the light was the same light from the old recordings, filtered through the same kind of air. She had studied this light. She had seen it in every historical image the fleet's archive contained. She had not known, until now, that studying a thing and standing inside it were two entirely different experiences. She stayed for a long time. Back in Accord Space, Orville published his account of the long vigil. He had been writing it for 6 months, using his journals, the fleet's own records, the conversations he had been part of, the things he had seen and the things he had understood only afterward. It was a long work, written for a general audience rather than an academic one, and it took him 2 years to finish it properly. When it was released, it became the most widely read document the Accord had produced in living memory. Within 5 years, it was in every Accord school that taught history. Within a generation, children on worlds that had never seen a human learned about the long vigil the way children learn about the things that define what people are capable of when they decide not to stop. They learned about the 900 million people who came home. They learned about the weapons built for precision, because the people who made them had decided that was the kind of people they wanted to be. They learned about the engineer who said that humans are stubborn enough to make the universe blink first, and they learned why, after 2,000 years, that was not a boast. It was a description. 1 year after the signing, a joint survey mission launched toward a region of space that neither the Accord nor the Allied nations had fully charted. It was a voluntary mission, assembled from both sides, 8 Accord science vessels and 9 fleet survey ships, traveling side by side toward the dark beyond the known edge. As they departed, the lead fleet vessel opened a communication channel on a frequency anyone within range could receive, and broadcast a single signal. It was the old IFF code, Third Fleet, Allied Nations of Earth, the same code that Orville had heard at Outpost Varan and recognized and written a single line about in his log. The code repeated 3 times. Then it went quiet. Not because there was nothing more to say, but because the code had always been a call, a way of announcing that the fleet was present and waiting to be found. And now they were found. They were home or building one. They were working and planning and arguing about the best way to restore an atmosphere and drawing pictures of what the old cities might look like when they were built again. The call was done. The watch had begun. And somewhere in the quiet of the outer dark, whatever came next was already on its way, and humanity, as it had always been, was already preparing for it.